Hey, Dominic.
Hey Jenna, how
I'm
you
feeling
doing?
better. I'm feeling so much better. This
Oh,
morning was not cool. I still have seasonal allergies, but man, this morning I was stuffed.
you were terrible yesterday. You sounded terrible.
Yeah, no, I really like,
I
I
was
get really,
concerned.
really bad. It's the one bad part about living around so many trees. I love the
Hmm.
trees, but I hate the pollen.
Well, I'm
Uh,
glad you're feeling better as you
Sorry. The nose wiping is going to happen
it's
periodically. It's just,
I feel you. All
all
right.
right, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off,
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
and we're looking at all of it. So, if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Oh, see, I can't even stop sniffling. It's not cool.
Oh, it's please with like you said, it's allergies. What can you do?
I mean, it's sort of, I don't know what I can do. I can't take any more drugs. That I know I cannot do.
Uh, I feel you. Um, so we had an interesting week this week, right?
We
We
did. We were, as Beyonce said, we were outside, literally, which was
literally.
exciting. Exciting. I want us to be able to do more things outside. I mean, I love talking to you in the little square, but I also
Yes.
love being able to talk to
We,
you in person.
yes, we went to a media get together,
Hmm.
news media get together.
Which we're gonna
And
have a piece on. It's
yep,
coming. So that's something really cool.
that was a lot of fun. Met some cool people. And yeah, that should be a really great interview when we get that up soon. But
Hmm.
yeah. So do you want to get to the headlines?
Yes, let's get to this week's headlines. And I mean, it's not terrible doom and gloom like it usually is, right?
Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. You know,
Well, we're not
it's
doing
not
layoffs, but
it's not
we're
layoffs.
talking about the reasons, part of why the layoffs keep happening.
Exactly. It's not. So this was from the Associated Press. The
Okay,
headline
reputable news
was,
source.
yes, the headline was news organizations have trust issues as they gear up for another election. And basically, it was the Associated Press um, and the Associated Press, it's the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. They got together and they conducted a poll. And it says that about half of Americans, 53%, say they are extremely or very concerned that news organizations will report inaccuracies or misinformation during the election. And 42% are worried that news outlets will use generative artificial intelligence, AI, to create stories. It's really, I mean, I think it goes to the point of how much trust people have in journalism right now at this
It
point.
does. It's like it's very, I think it's very, very critical and important about the trust factor, but it
Hmm.
also speaks to the way that this business is run. Because
Hmm.
you and I both know there's more than a few people who are, in charge of news organizations who are just like, wait a second, I don't have to pay somebody. I can just get a computer to do it. And that's part, I mean, that's a factor in it, is that an AI program is cheaper than a person who needs healthcare and retirement. So I
And
would
it
like
depends.
to say that it's not going to happen, but
And it's also the way in which people are getting their news. So if you're, they mention over here, younger people, those under 30, are more likely to get election news. So this specifically was about election news, but from social media or friends or family, as they are to get it from national or local news outlets, that kind of tells you a little bit too of how you're getting it isn't, that is part of what is, makes it, a reputable news organization versus, something that's sort of being passed on, where misinformation and disinformation can happen. So that
Well,
was
yes, but I mean, just in people's defense, misinformation and disinformation has gotten really well cloaked and isn't all
mm,
that easily
mhm,
discernible. Like, I mean, there's stuff
mhm,
that I've had to give a second look to be like, wait like, when something feels off, but you're not quite sure why.
yeah.
Had I not been doing this for a living for so many years, I probably just would have been like, oh, that's a thing.
I saw something online. It was actually with the News Literacy Project where they showed a bogus headline that was with the New York Times. And it was basically how the New York Times, it was something about Mr. Beast and who's a social media personality and some kind of contest he was holding. And it looked like a real New York Times headline. But then when you went back and they typed that in the New York Times search mode, they didn't find it. So it's just sometimes you see something and you can get so caught up in it and
But
not
here's the
realize.
thing, in the time that you just explained that to me, yeah, I've shared that incorrect headline to like four or five of my
Exactly.
friends. Oh my God, did you see that? Like, yeah. Um, yeah. That I mean, I get why people are concerned about that. And then
Yeah.
um, but being able to discern what is a headline versus what isn't, or what is a reputable news source and what isn't, is becoming unbelievably critical. And another, you know,
And
I don't want to
difficult.
say, yeah, typical. Is that what we're calling it?
Difficult. Well, I mean,
Oh,
difficult in
difficult.
this.
Yeah, it's not typical.
No,
Difficult.
difficult.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, difficult in the sense of it is something that it's gotten more, tough to sort of, you really do have to investigate doing reverse imaging research and all these things. It's like before, yeah, it's
Well,
just
it's
gotten a little bit
weird.
more
It's almost
complicated.
like that push to be first
Yeah.
that some, especially news outlets that deal with breaking news and they need or want to be first on something has somehow infected the rest of the public because now everybody thinks that they're a journalist or a news influencer. And so and you don't necessarily give yourself that time to consider what it is that you're sharing or if this information is correct or who is the source of it. Where is this coming from to begin with?
Um, Now this next headline really is sort of just more similar to what we just discussed there in the sense of it's from the University of Michigan, and it's basically a study that they worked on with um, Duke. And it says over here, as people have more difficulty distinguishing fact from fiction in the US, they're more likely to feel news fatigue and avoid news altogether. Um, I think that's another part of this too, is the fact that people really do get, there's a fatigue
Oh,
in terms
completely.
of that information of how you know what I mean? Like there's just a fatigue and the sense of like people just then after a while start feeling like, well, why am I going to pay attention to this? Oh my goodness, it's so stressful right now to
Not only
do
is it
this.
stressful, but like it would frequently headlines can be very depressing, which is why it was so exciting to talk to like solutions journalism that it doesn't have to be. But yeah, I remember like in the past few years, a lot of people just being like, yeah, I don't read the news or I don't watch the news. I don't anymore. And if you are already suspicious of media outlets and you already feel like they're not telling you the truth, which again, whenever people say that to me, at least, my next question or my first question is always, well, where are you getting your news from? Because again, like that can have a big difference in whether or not you're just getting echo chamber confirmation bias or if you are actually getting information. And then on top of that, um, well, this has always been one of my biggest pet peeves, but so we're talking okay, so let's say we're talking about broadcast news and specifically television and in a lot of legacy media outlets like there's obviously the newscast for the evening, which is just going to give you, the headlines and, a brief story about what's happening in your community. But if you're watching perhaps more national news, you're probably watching more analysis stuff where people are talking about the headlines. And that, and listen, for the sake of keeping people engaged, if and you could tell me this, you did producing, you want to book people who are going to get people riled up, that's going to keep them engaged and on that channel. watching the advertisements in between segments, etc. And but if that's what you're only or that's what you've come to view the news media as, then unfortunately, yeah, I could see where people
Hmm.
might be like, I can't anymore. I'm checking out.
Yeah. And I think, well, because that comes with, listen, if you're talking about broadcast, part of it is bringing people, bringing people to your show. You want to know how many the viewership that you have.
Yeah.
And that comes with sometimes putting out content that feels like it's going to grab people's attention. How am I going to grab people? And with our attention spans being ever so, you know, more difficult to maintain throughout watching something, it's like everything gets less and less. So it's just really, yeah, it's a tough thing. But one thing before we head off to our guests, I just want to make a
Mhm.
correction. Because I just
Oh,
noticed here
okay.
that Michigan study was actually just by the University of Michigan, not Duke. So I just noticed that. I wanted to correct it before I sent out my own misinformation.
I was gonna say that is very responsible journalism, Dom.
So just
Congratulations, sir.
catching it there.
All right, well, let's go to our interview.
So, building on the headlines we just discussed, it leads us to the discussion with our next guest, who joins us to explain what exactly is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Are there skills we can all learn to spot a questionable news story? And with many Americans saying they distrust news, is there a way to earn back trust for true journalism? We welcome Erin Olson, Senior Manager of State Partnerships of the News Literacy Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that seeks to give people of all ages and backgrounds the skills of how to identify credible news. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you for having me.
So, just starting up the conversation, how
Mm.
do we recognize what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Um, and I guess in terms also, how do we help earn back trust for journalists?
So that's a large question, and
I know.
let's just start with the first part.
Yes.
Misinformation. It comes down to intent. Information that's often shared without ill intent. It's shared accidentally. It might be that doctored nature photo posted on Facebook that everyone is amazed by and posts it and reposts it um, unwittingly and not understanding that that isn't an accurate depiction of whatever that scene was in nature. So, of course, that example doesn't seem to do a lot of harm at first um, because it wasn't intentionally shared. But a category of misinformation, disinformation, that is harmful, intended to be such. It's deliberately created for the purpose of misinforming, for the purpose of causing harm, to make one entity appear better than the other, to further one's agenda. And so either way, no matter the intent, which we know is really hard to infer, uh, it's still misinformation. And so while there is a difference, I think it's important to note that even what seems to be harmless, like that nature photo, depending on our social spaces algorithm, that might invite harmful content into our feeds because we've interacted with something that wasn't real. Now, the second part of your question, uh, thinking about how do we earn back trust? Um, uh, I'm going to simply answer with transparency. I think that's a first step, which we see reputable spaces and places sharing the process, having even on their home pages, who are the creators, what's the byline of that writer, who sponsors, who all of that about information is helpful in that trust. But I think that transparency aspect is important, as well as just the general public knowing more about journalism itself, and that journalists adhere to standards. I think that's an important aspect. And so perhaps, educating the general public more about those standards that journalists do follow.
And I do want to get into what exactly are those standards, because again, there's always that question of what is real journalism and what isn't. But I wonder if there's become a level of, I don't know, personal semantics when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. We've seen over the past few years definitely a rise in both. And when people get called out saying, well, no, 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 that wasn't what you're claiming it is. It wasn't misinformation. I wasn't intending to misinform. You're putting words in my mouth, or you're putting your agenda on what I put out there. How do people begin to navigate something that is so clouded and confusing sometimes?
I think what you just said, because it is so clouding and confusing. We are in this complex landscape, trying to navigate the flood of information, misinformation, and disinformation that enters our feeds. And so we got to get back to strategies. I'm going to say that that's what we have to equip ourselves with, the strategies to maybe hone those skills to critically think about what comes into our feeds. Because when you think about the times that people are interacting with information that is cloudy, that is mis or disinformation, we might not be in the mindset to critically think, because we're doom scrolling, or we're just passing time in a waiting room and seeing all that enters all those social spaces. And so I think we have to make habit to question what we see, what we read, and then employ those strategies that journalists employ. And that's fact checking, check sources, take a beat, pause. If something triggers us, well, that's a tactic, and have that awareness to just pause. Is this legit? And then take a few moments to do that lateral read, to fact check. And it really doesn't take a lot of time just to investigate. But again, we have to amp up those skills to make them habit, so we do interrupt that doom scroll. We do interrupt that passive absorption of whatever enters the spaces that we're frequenting. So, we can critically think about what we're encountering.
Erin, what are some of the tools that people can actually do in terms of checking on articles that they might, and I think it's always good to have a healthy curiosity of that. What are some tools that people can do from home?
So one of my favorites is lateral reading. You see something that might feel triggering or that makes you go, you pull up a tab, another tab, and you search. You pull out things and start searching. And if you don't see that information present across multiple platforms, it's probably not real. And so I think that's an easy thing to do. And of course, along those lines, same with reverse image search. There's capabilities to do that, where you can take an image that you see that might seem obnoxious, or might seem, again, I'm going to use the word triggering, that you're upset by what you just saw and you cannot believe what you just saw. Well, okay, let's check that out. Let's reverse image search. Let's use the technology that brings us the information to check the information. And I think we can get savvy about that. But same with just simple skills. When we have, if it feels off, it probably is off. And what I mean by that is when you see those red flags or patterns. So some of the ones that you'll see bad actors use often when they're spreading mis and disinformation are things like, let that sink in. And I'm sure we've all seen that accompanied by some post, right? Or make this go viral. Like, really? the media won't report this. Now,
That one's my favorite. That is my
yes.
favorite, usually red flag that most people miss. They're like, "Oh my God, you're right. The media won't
Yes.
report it." And I'm like, "No, that's not how this works."
No, not at all. And so just having, that understanding, some of those in the pocket, I think is helpful. And the same with patterns. I find that, you heard me mention that doctored nature photo that just seems so amazing, that's too good to be true, and it is. So looking for those patterns and images shared. Same with, one that gets spread often are photos of protests and crowds. And that's shared out of context with someone, adding a completely different storyline to what that actual image was or what it originated as. And so that's something that we can go back to, reverse image search, to find what was the original story. And then, of course, when you see screenshots of articles with no links, again, a pattern. So I think there are those look fors that if we get used to honing those skills and having a keen eye, I think that's helpful in our awareness.
That's also completely interesting, and that fits with everything that at least I as a journalist know to be true. But at the
Mhm.
same time, more and more people have said that they're getting their information, their news from social media. And
Mhm.
social media platforms are really just looking to keep you on the platform. They're not here to fact check anything. That they've made
Mhm.
that painfully clear. So when social media platforms are using information, or perhaps users, won't say the platforms, but users on those platforms, content creators, are posting information that is intended to get an emotional reaction, is that something that people should be investigating? Because when you're so emotionally charged, you see something that's so triggering, as you've said, I'm not necessarily thinking about that checklist or
Mhm.
anything else like that. I want to react and tell you you're wrong, and here's why.
Yeah, I think there is an awareness. I mean, and it's just science, right? Like when we think about how our brain works, we start shutting off our critical thinking skills when we're angered, and so we really need to have that awareness. And when you mention those social channels, I can't help but think about how we teach driving to our youth. They have to know something about the car to be able
Mm.
to drive the car. I mean, to maintain the car, right? Like, you don't have to know how to rebuild an engine to drive a car, but you surely need to know that an oil needs to be changed and checked, that you need fuel of some kind, that your tires need air. Like, we have this basic understanding of a vehicle to drive the vehicle. But I find that we lack basic understanding of these tools' algorithms. Like, how do they keep us engaged in that space? And how do we get content delivered to us? Um, I think that's an important learning as part of news and media literacy, that we understand how the thing works enough to know and have that awareness that, I mean, just like Google, I'm going to simplify this, but where you are physically, where you've been in the digital space, and how much time you spent there will impact your search return. Do all of our students understand that the first thing that appears isn't the best thing? Do all of our users understand what we interact with on TikTok is going to feed us more of that same kind of thing in that space? And that can be dangerous, especially when we know about echo chambers. We need to diversify. And I think that comes right back down to understanding the spaces that we're in and how they work.
So, one of the other things I'm wondering is, given this landscape, I mean, there's always been different types of journalism that traditional legacy media has engaged in, hard news, analysis, and opinion. But I'm not entirely sure the public is as clear in differentiating. Oftentimes, again, this is a social media anecdote, but when I see people getting the most riled up about something that they've seen from a legacy media outlet, it's usually an opinion piece that wasn't hard news reporting, and people aren't making that differential.
Yeah, I would agree. And as a former English teacher, it comes right back to understanding purpose of information. Like have we I mean, we can't forget that when we look at a text, when we look at media, what is the purpose? And that's an element of this learning, is understanding purpose. And opinion journalism has a place and is important, just as a hard story is important and just as investigative journalism is important. But all of these things that I'm describing are far different than blogger and basement. So all information posted is not created necessarily equal with the same set of standards or the same objectives. And there's a space for, all kinds of text, of course, and media. And that's also been the beauty of the web, that it's given voice to everyone, but that's also the caution of the web, that it's given voice to everyone, where we, have to be mindful of what we're interacting with and what we're engaging with, because saying it doesn't always make it so. So again, critical thinking is so important.
Well, it also goes to, we talk about legacy media, but there are a lot of smaller
Mhm.
media companies that many people go to for their news. And it can make things confusing, because oftentimes, those organizations might not have the same type of journalism ethics and information. And how does someone know if the site that they're going to, or the entity they're going to, would be considered a reputable one?
Uh, I would think all of that about information. I mean, they're transparent and in that, who they are, what they do, what they're about. So I think that's something we look for. And then I think a reputable news organization is not going to, in their straight news, their hard news stories aren't trying to accomplish an agenda. They're not trying to sway one way or another. I think another way is that we lateral read and we see that information posted across, other sources as well. But I do think that transparency component is important. And I also think when we come back to those standards of journalism, I think even, all of us don't get it right 100% of the time. So if a reputable news outlet gets it wrong on accident, they have no problem calling out the mistake and apologizing and righting that wrong. And I think that we only see with reputable sources, where they're the first to admit when maybe something wasn't as it should have been.
Um, Also, I guess, everything we're discussing here, for people who are consuming news, it's a lot of work. And I think some
Mhm.
people could be sort of feel a little bit intimidated after all. It's like, well, can I trust anything?
Mm.
We're talking about reverse image, I guess, like, how is it that we know that we're not also overdoing the research? When are the times that we
Mhm.
know that we should be doing this and times that maybe we shouldn't?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, what's worse than trusting everything would be trusting nothing.
Hmm.
So there has to be a balance of healthy skepticism. Uh, I think about these skills, and we use skills in our everyday life, in our interactions with people, without even thinking about it. When we are navigating a new space, right? Like, does this feel right? Does this not feel right? Am I comfortable? Am I not comfortable? Some of those intuitive skills that we have developed, I think, play right into this space. And so it's easy to see where people might just shut everything off. This is too much. I'm going to avoid all information because none of it's true. That extreme, but that's not how we get better at doing exactly what I'm talking about. We get better and it becomes natural when we practice it, when we make this habit. And that's why I think early education is imperative to this quest. Um, And so I guess the the best advice I have, pause. Takes 2 seconds.
Oh,
Pause. Okay, we evaluated. Move on. And we also don't have to share everything we see. We don't have to on our, social media feeds. Everything that enters our feed, we don't have to pass on. So if we don't want to take the time to fact check, how about just don't share? I mean, there's your time saver. I think there's so many things that we can do that don't require a lot of effort. Um, that I might even say we overcomplicate this.
Hmm.
It can just come back to take a moment, think, move on.
I kind of want to circle back though a little bit. Oh my God, I'm using such cliched language, circle back, but I do want to go back to a point that you were making about bloggers, etc. Part of
Mhm.
why perhaps some of them were able to gain as much trust as they have is because they weren't attached to a legacy media, that they were, citizen journalists just out here on their own. And you can trust me. I don't have an agenda with
Mm,
advertisers or backers like they do, etc. And that can be very, very enticing, I think,
mhm.
especially for people perhaps who have felt marginalized and not listened to in the first
Yeah.
place. So, again, going back to what you were saying earlier about what is a reputable journalist source, what makes a journalist as opposed to someone who perhaps is just on Nextdoor or something, some sort of community forum telling people what they think is going on? What's the difference?
Oh, oh, that's, I mean, a great question. And we have a lesson on Checkology. It's one of our lesson platforms called Info Zones.
Hmm.
And it really gets at this, understanding the zones of information. What's the difference of an influencer versus a scientist versus a journalist? It it helps students consider what the thing is. And then when you understand what the thing is, thinking about the purpose of the thing, and then thinking about what we do with the thing, how we interact with it. It's and those elements, those learnings have been embedded into English language arts standards for a very long time. But I've mentioned the standards of journalism, uh, and I'm going to mention it again. I don't know
Always,
that.
always.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that everybody realizes that journalists have standards, just as educators, just as doctors, just as lawyers. There's a code of ethics, and within that, during the process, honoring multiple credible sources, avoiding bias, presenting facts and necessary context, documentation, reports, all of that. Stories and sources are verified. There's a balance. Presenting facts within context, a
Hmm.
fairness, treating sources and subjects with appropriate respect. Those elements are evident within the context of what journalists are doing. Um, and they went to school for this. I mean, we have trained journalists, right? Like this is their work, this is their passion, and I I think it calls to question what's the intent. Like I want to know, like when people are telling me and drawing attention to what they're writing, well, what's your intent? What do you want me to do with this? What do you hope to accomplish? What do you want your audience to do? There's a far different, cry from I'm informing my audience so they can make the best decisions about their life for their life. And I want them to be informed versus I want to influence them, um, to very different purposes.
That, my God, just that alone brings up so many questions for me, but I will focus on one. And that is, how responsible are we as journalists to hold each other accountable? Because when you were talking about the ethics, and I've
Mm,
mentioned this before, it's kind of an honor system. It's not like you're licensed as a journalist, and if you violate those ethics, you lose your
mhm.
license. It's really like on my honor, I will try. And so when there are other people in the field, sometimes in the same, press room as you, who are not adhering to the, do we hold any responsibility to holding each other ethically responsible? Or is that a thing where, like, it's not for an individual reporter to do, but perhaps for legacy media outlets to hold other legacy media outlets? I feel like that's part of where the confusion falls in, because you can have people who are here to, in a press room, for example, who are there to write propaganda, to be perfectly frank, and then people who are there to just get whatever the information is that's being delivered and disseminate accordingly.
I wish I had a fantastic answer for this, but I mean, we know historically we've gotten it wrong. And I just say we, our society,
Yeah.
that we haven't always done this justice, that, there are communities that were harmed by lack of reporting or not honoring these standards. And I think that, we work to right those wrongs. We work to acknowledge those wrongs. And as far as an accountability, an outlet should hold the people within the outlet accountable. That's part of being a reputable news outlet. But I also think, we as consumers can hold creators accountable as well. I mean, I don't know that any of us are off the hook per se for that accountability piece, but we also can acknowledge that there are fantastic people in every profession, and then in every profession, there's mistakes happen. So I don't know that I have the answer to this question per se, but I do think that we see legacy media outlets working to ensure that these elements are honored.
Okay.
And, as technology develops and, there's a lot of concern from people about AI and how if it's being used in journalism, how is it being used? Is there a place for it? And also how transparent should reporters or media companies be in terms of if it is being used?
Well, transparency with any source is important. That's true when we talk about AI. There could be accuracy and copyright issues. We know that AI, I think it's such a soft word that it's used to describe this, but it hallucinates, it creates mis and disinformation. But there are challenges with AI generated content being passed off as real. At NLP, we really think that the challenge requires a multi-pronged approach, that tech companies, government regulation can play an important role, but it really is up to us to learn to identify credible and real content, and that will become increasingly difficult as AI continues to get better at. I hardly want to say the word creation, because it isn't creating. I mean, it's just moving some things around and making predictions in language. If you know a little bit about how AI works, but it, as far as a space and place in any field, I think transparency is key. I mean, that conversation's happening in the education field, for example. How can we use the power of AI to be efficient with, finding patterns or for managing data, or, insert use. I see that. I think all professions are grappling with that, how to maximize its use while also thinking about ethical use. And I think that conversation will continue
Most definitely.
as AI changes, for sure.
The nonprofit group Media Literacy Now had an annual report, and it showed that 18 states so far have passed bills pushing for media literacy education in schools, California being one of the latest. What are the students being taught? Like, what are the young people being taught in terms of, detecting and debunking misinformation?
Well, so the bills that have been passed differ in nature. Some require, and I believe it's just a few states that actually require news and media literacy, or news literacy as part of media literacy. And then others have that infused into other content standards. So the bills all differ in nature with what's being asked of students, but at the heart of that, educators are working hard to amp up those skills and strategies that students have when they're navigating information, when they're not only reading, consuming, but also even creating. So, you've heard me mention it already during our time together, but this requires skill building, and I sincerely appreciate that, because this is about not teaching or telling students what to think. It's helping them and thinking about how to think about the information that they interact with. And simply it comes down to, analyzing, evaluating, interpreting, understanding responsibility. And I'll repeat that, understanding responsibility that we have when with sharing, with creating information. And all of this that we talk about is not hopeless. And I think that's a message with education, because through learning, through thinking, we can help stop the spread. It can stop with us. We don't have to push on what enters our feed to cause more harm. And so I think that the skills that, educators are focusing on, they're attaching that to, their civics courses, their ELA courses, even library and media science courses. They have elements of this identifying, evaluating, utilizing credible information. And so I do appreciate that educators, have the opportunity to infuse instead of feeling like something is an add-on, because we know no matter what profession we have, we encounter information. It's in every facet of our life, as I see news and media literacy as part of all the spaces and places in our education system.
When you were saying about how, students need to better understand and to analyze what they're taking in, etc. I'm also wondering, for the business of journalism, for the business of news media, is it important for either us or somehow should journalists be humanized? And when I say humanized, I mean a lot of times, I mean, obviously we're people, but sometimes is it obvious? A lot of times the way people the mainstream media, and they sort of talk about it as this large amoebic sort of, thing, which it's not. We're all individuals who 90% of us, I would say, are really just, trying our very hardest for very little money to get out there and inform the public as best we possibly can. So is that, I guess, an essential part of it, to keep people from thinking of, again, the media as this sort of like I don't know, boogeyman, which some people seem to.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's so abstract. That's so distant from us when we put everyone and everything in that term, like the media, and we often hear that not used in a respectful way. So I appreciate that you said humanize, because I think that's true of a lot of professions that serve people, that we need to humanize people in those professions. And I see journalists as a serving profession as well, delivering a service, a needed component to our democracy, of course, free press, right? So something that I am so proud that we have at the News Literacy Project is our Checkology platform with free lessons for educators. But in that, we have Newsroom to Classroom. So there's vetted journalists from across the country that donate their time to connect to classrooms, to extend the learning, to share their process, to share their expertise. And I think that's a fantastic step in that right direction for our students to be able to see themselves in this profession, and to hear from those who are in this profession doing the work, this very important work. And that comes right back to the comment that you made about we should and need to humanize the profession.
So Erin, our last question is about how
Mhm.
did you come to journalism? Like, why is it important to you?
Well, it's a bit of a nostalgic answer. I grew up in a home where we had multiple newspapers in the home. And I fondly remember, my dad and mom returning from work, opening up the newspaper and discussing what they were reading with one another in my presence and in the presence of my brothers and I. And and then of course it was exciting if our names made the paper for, one school event or another. That was celebrated and the clipping was cut and put on the fridge and or sent to, another family member. So there was something beautiful about that because I think back and I learned how to engage in discourse by listening to my parents have productive conversations around what was happening in our community. Um, I got to witness their love of reading, their love of news, their respect for journalism from a young age. And the same is true of the radio, listening to the radio, to the news in the car, as well as watching the evening news. And the same conversations ensued. So I appreciated that time and I appreciated being part of those conversations. And I know we've, talked about when people feel overwhelmed, they avoid all of that content. They avoid the news, they avoid the newspaper, they avoid, insert outlet. And how unfortunate. Like I feel extremely grateful that I got to be part of that experience from in my childhood and even in my adulthood. And in fact, I bring that tradition right with me into my home where we have multiple physical newspapers. We watch the news, we talk about that in front of our children. And I think that's really important. So my love started at an early age. My love of reading and of course my love of writing went right into teaching English. And then that brought me here because it is important. And I have to tell you, I want for my community, I want for my family, I want for my kids the best possible life. And I think that happens when you're able to make the best possible decisions based on the most accurate information. And that can only happen with news literacy.
Erin, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to say I was kind of smiling while you were talking because that literally mirrors my own childhood experience and exposure to news. But so Erin Olson, Senior Manager of State Partnerships at News Literacy Project. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right, it is spotlight time. Spotlight of the week. Are you
Do you want
excited,
to
Dom?
start? Yeah, do you want to start?
Yes. Okay, so my spotlight, and again, I know that we have spoken numerous times about branching out, but there's so much news in New York City. And so my spotlight comes from Amsterdam News. And for anyone who doesn't know, Amsterdam News is New York City's oldest Black newspaper that offers a Black view within national and international and local news. And when I say Black view, I mean it's stories told with the African American point of view taken into consideration. A lot of times that's not the case. I mean, there's been studies that have talked about how the American default is white, and that's why most white people don't necessarily understand confirmation bias because it's just always been there as the default. But anyway, so that's what Amsterdam News is, and caught my attention because they did a piece um that is about the protests that happened or that took place at Columbia University. And what I thought was so interesting was that it put the whole thing in context of the university's long history of having protests. So the piece is called Echoes of the Past, Today's Student Protests Draw from History. This piece is by Tandy Lau, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he's a staff reporter from Report for America Corps, which is also really awesome. Anyway, so the article compares the student takeover of Hamilton Hall that happened just a few weeks ago, this spring semester, to the student takeover of the same building back in 1968. And so putting things again into a little bit of historical context at the time, and that time we're talking about is 68, there were a lot of protests happening across the country about the Vietnam War, which again, similarities, it's a war overseas and a war overseas. And not only was there that issue of the war, but there was also the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Anyway, this year's not over. I'm not even going to say anything. But there was also the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And there was also, at the time, Columbia was considering building a gymnasium, as according to the article, in nearby Morningside Park, which is a public park in Harlem, but this gymnasium would take over, part of the park grounds and would limit the open space that's there for the public. So as of circa now, at least, the students who spoke to the reporter for the Amsterdam News, a lot of whom did speak with first name only for privacy issues, because again, this is just a very heated situation, but they were talking about how they were inspired by the convictions and the actions of the students in 68 to, quote, build on the work of their elders. And of course, this being Columbia, they actually have a class on what took place on campus in 1968. So it's not like, these kids just pulled this out of nowhere. Um, they actually would have had the chance to study this previous anti-war movement. And so in the retelling of the 68 takeover, the article points out that this was not a smooth process, just like what just happened. And it talks about how it also divided the campus's few, but the Black students who were on campus at Columbia University and the white students who, while they were all in Hamilton Hall at one point, the Black students wanted to barricade it, the white students didn't. So the Black students kicked the white students out. And then the white students ended up taking over 4 other buildings. And this went way deeper than I could have imagined. And this went on for a couple of days, by the way. But something else that I thought was interesting in terms of how history doesn't exactly repeat, but it rhymes sometimes, is that just like today, when New York City Mayor Eric Adams and the NYPD said that, over 20%, I think they said like 29% of the protesters were actually outside agitators. According to the Amsterdam News, their reporting from 68, their own archival reporting was showing that similar accounts were made that non-student Harlem Blacks, that's how it was phrased in 68, were at the student sit-ins on campus, basically saying that outside agitators were coming onto campus and getting the Ivy League college students riled up. And they also talk about the way that in 68, members of the Harlem community did show up on campus to bring things like, food and, resources, et cetera, to the students so that they don't starve, I guess. And it was just really, really interesting to see this whole thing put into context because, of course, when you're dealing with a breaking news situation, in real time, you're very much dealing with the here and now. But again, part of what's so important about journalism is being able to understand the larger context in which a story is taking place. And that's really what this article drove home for me. It also included, responses from the university circa now. And that was a quote from Columbia's current president, Manoush Shafiq, who said that Colombia has a long and proud tradition of protest and activism on many important issues, such as the Vietnam War, civil rights, and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, all of which were issues that the students held building takeovers at Hamilton Hall and sit-ins at various different points throughout history. But the president, Shafiq, goes on to say, today's protesters are also fighting for an important cause, for the rights of Palestinians and against the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. They have many supporters in our community and have a right to express their views and engage in peaceful protest. And at the end of the article, because it does talk about, what was perhaps what in hindsight some people say was done right, what in hindsight some people said was done wrong. Draw your own conclusions circa now, because it really doesn't give any take either side in terms of the moment that we're in right now, but it does point out at the very end that ultimately Columbia never built that gym in Morningside Heights. Now, I don't know if that's going to work for the current demands that students are making when it comes to divesting. That is a huge issue that involves a lot of funding, but it was a really, really interesting and I thought important issue because, again, nothing happens inside of a vacuum. Everything happens inside of a larger context. And that's one of the things that I find so beautiful about well done journalism is that you're able to get a fuller understanding, not just of what's happening in the moment, but the context in which it's happening.
I think that's great. I think it's so important. And it's something that is lacking a lot of stories that end up getting published
It
because
really is.
it also does take time. And you have to have that time to do the research. It's not something that
Mm-hmm.
automatically sometimes is, gets churned out in breaking news situations. You actually do need time to look at the history, talk to the people, and also get into a moment where people are, um, y- you know, the emotions aren't as high so that you can look back and see different, a little bit more nuanced. So I think that's a great story and a great one to spotlight. Um, I will just go to this. I'll make this a quick one because I know we're running tight on time, but it's
I know I ran my mouth
from
a long time.
no, but it was an important one. But this actually is a good quick one to discuss. But it's about from the University of California, Los Angeles Newsroom, so UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was the article was downsizing local news contributes to crumbling infrastructure. And so now this is a study from UCLA and Duke University. So when I mentioned Duke earlier, this was the article
Okay,
that I
so this
mentioned
is
from.
where Duke actually factors in.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a new study from UCLA and Duke, and it shows how local journalism produce detailed coverage. When it produces detailed coverage about aging infrastructure, increases voter support for additional infrastructure investment. So basically, the more people know, like the more they kind of compared it. The study surveyed 3,300 adults, each read a news style story about an upcoming election with an incumbent mayor, mayoral challenger, and a property tax increase averaging $40 annually to fund aging infrastructure. The sample stories described either a local dam or a sewer system, and the control groups were given articles from either that were they offered very little reporting or the reporting was actually done by AI. And then they had articles that were
Mm.
much more in depth and had added a few extra paragraphs. And basically what they noticed was the more information people had, the more they cared about the infrastructure aspect and the more willing they were to support it. So I thought that was really fascinating about how true journalism, ones that are actually, if you need the staff, because if you don't have this another aspect they also get to in this piece is the fact that, well, in their study research was the fact that guess what? If people have the information, if you have the staff to actually cover these stories, people care about it and they
Mm-hmm.
will come out and vote. But if you don't, then, it says over here, voters demonstrated a willingness to hold local politicians accountable when provided with context in local reporting. So these are all super important details of why local reporting is so important and why it being staffed is important correctly and giving people the time to actually do these types of surveys and results. So something I'd love us to, yeah, hopefully follow up
Well,
on.
listen, you can't do journalism on the cheap.
Nope.
Yeah. On that note, Dom, until next week.
Until next week. Bye, Jenna.
All right, bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.